I think regardless, the countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region in particular, need to be spending more on national defense.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact here at the United States Study Center. Thank you for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. From the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear sites to stopping military support for Ukraine, U.S. defense policy under the second Trump administration is frequently making front-page news and is shifting decades of norms and precedents. What have been the most major shifts in defense policy during the second Trump administration? What have been the areas of continuity from President Biden to President Trump? And what does this mean for the Indo-Pacific? To discuss these questions, we're joined today by Kelly Magsamen, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Senior Advisor at the Asia Group. Kelly is joining the USSC this week as part of the Center's Next Generation Leaders in the Australia-US Alliance Project. So thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I look forward to hearing your by-the-numbers stat at the end of the episode. That'll be interesting.
Very good. Very good.
All right. So just to kick off, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, your role as Chief of Staff to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and what really were your priorities in that time?
Certainly. Well, thank you again for having me on. Chief of Staff role is a pretty multifaceted role. You're part counselor to the secretary. You're part chief implementer of his priorities in the department. There's the less sexy parts of the job in terms of setting up the governance process within the department itself. I saw my role as largely decision support and making sure that when the Secretary of Defense had to make decisions, whether they were on use of force or on budget or on, just general health of the force issues or even foreign policy issues, that he had all the information available to him and all the tools at his disposal to make a good decision. And that is largely, comes in the form of having good process within the department, good governance, but also making sure that he had all the information he needed to make those decisions. So that's part of it. Obviously, you play a role. I played a role in helping him set his priorities, doing a lot of strategic planning around that, kind of what he wanted to achieve during his term as Secretary of Defense, and then making sure to move the wheels of the department to implement those priorities. And so a lot of behind the scenes work. It's a very much behind the scenes role. I also was, a significant interface for him with the political side of the administration. So a lot of engagement with the White House senior staff, the National Security Council, and also other interagency colleagues. So yes, very much a very varied role, as most chief of staff jobs are. Often very thankless. But, it was such a privilege in the sense that, you get a, firsthand seat at history. And you're there and you're present in the room for all of those major decisions. And I felt very lucky to work for such a stellar leader of the department. And yes, so that's sort of the background on it.
Yeah, excellent. And what would you say were his top priorities in his time as defense secretary? What was he most focused on strategically and that he wanted to achieve in that role?
Well, when we first came into office, we set three major priorities. One is defending the nation, obviously, and there's a number of things that fit within that. Two was taking care of our people in terms of both the military themselves, their families, as well as our civilian personnel. And then the third was succeeding through teamwork. So we had these sort of three guiding priorities throughout his term. And we really pushed to drive progress on all three fronts. Obviously the world comes into play in these jobs. So you can sort of set your priorities and then the world kind of interferes. And so, he's very well known for his work on Ukraine. I mean, I don't think we stepped into the department thinking that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was going to happen in 2022. When we first took over, we had the COVID pandemic that was still raging. So it seems like so long ago, but at the time we were still dealing with major COVID issues across the country, and Secretary Austin was very keen on making sure that the military did whatever it could to support civilian agencies on vaccine delivery, et cetera. So one of his first moves was to do some work on that. And then obviously we had our national defense strategy that laid out its own priorities, and China being the pacing challenge. So, Secretary Austin spent a good portion of his time leaning into the alliance dimension of his work. So, building and strengthening those alliances, obviously the case of Australia, we did a lot of work. We can talk about AUKUS and some of those other issues, but really, spent a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific building out force posture, initiatives within the region, and spending a lot of time with our partners and allies out here. So he was very much an ally guy, and enjoyed working with Deputy Prime Minister Marles in particular on doing some of the work here within the Australian alliance. So
yeah, I went to DC in 2023, and we had some meetings at the Pentagon. And I think every meeting we had with them started with a focus on alliances or allies. Like, that came through in everything we did. So I think that definitely trickled down. It clearly was a priority that, permeated through all the work that was being done.
Well, certainly. And, I think at his core, he's a big coalition builder. So whether that manifested itself through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which we built after the invasion, but it's in his DNA. I mean, when he was CENTCOM commander, the counter-ISIS campaign, he built a huge coalition around counter-ISIS, which actually was a little bit of the inspiration for the Ukraine Contact Group. So he just sees allies as a key enabler of success, and views them as partners in what we're all trying to do. So that's just kind of baked within who he is. And so naturally, when it came time to spending time with allies, he was always up for that.
Yeah. And I think that, meshes well with President Biden, who was almost like a legislator in chief because of his long career and history in Congress. But that focus on coalition building, works well between the defense side of things and his approach as president. Now we are 6 months into the second Trump administration. I don't know that we'd describe it the same way. They've had a very kind of like move fast and break things approach toward policy in a wide range of areas. But do you see any areas of continuity kind of between, in defense policy from the Biden era to the second Trump term?
I do. I think the good news is that I think it's still a priority for the Trump administration. The Indo-Pacific is a priority for the Trump administration. And I think that is something that has, even since Trump won, when their first national defense strategy came out, and they named China the core, competitor of the United States. Our national defense strategy built upon that. Although we added Russia as an acute threat, it turns out that was correct as well. So I do think there's going to be that continuity around the China challenge facing the United States and what that means for defense policy in the Indo-Pacific. So, you saw Secretary Hegseth out in the region visiting, Japan, the Philippines, saying the right things, doing the right things. So there is a level of continuity, I think, in that regard. I think the difference is going to be a lot of stylistic things. But certainly, Trump 1.0 was kind of the warm-up act in some ways. And Trump 2.0, I think, is, the president is taking a much more aggressive approach to his priorities, I think in part because, I think his sense was that there were too many constraints on him and what he was trying to achieve in his first term. So, yes, it's a little bit more blunt instrument. And, certainly the president has placed an emphasis on the importance of allies stepping up to the plate in terms of their defense spending. So that is not inconsistent with obviously many presidents' pushes on allies and partners. I think I've worked for many secretaries of defense and presidents, and they've all had that talking point for many years. It's a little bit more aggressive by President Trump. But listen, I think, I applaud the administration for the achievement at NATO in terms of getting NATO to step up. I think NATO, needed to do that regardless of whether the Trump administration was putting pressure on them, given the security environment that has changed post-Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think they were trending in that direction actually at the end of the Biden administration anyway. So Trump was pushing on a little bit of an open door there.
I mean, it's interesting because so many things have kind of both shifted geopolitically, but then we've seen this second Trump administration act in a number of these, areas where there have been tensions or things that have lasted for a while. So we've seen some changes, like we've seen, a ceasefire in Gaza, the U.S. bombing of Iranian nuclear sites, and negotiations happening between Russia and Ukraine. How much of this do you think would have happened regardless of who was president at this time? And what elements do you think are unique to a second Trump term?
It's interesting. I tend not to subscribe to the great man theory of international relations. I tend to believe that there are far more complex dynamics that play into a lot of these things. But there's no doubt that President Trump is taking a significant change in approach on many things. It's hard to like generalize across all of those issues you just outlined, but certainly, I think about Gaza, for example. At the end of the Biden administration, we had been doing a lot of work on a ceasefire, and actually our team was in close touch with the Trump administration incoming team to hand off, a set of conditions for them to try to get to a ceasefire. So I think there's, in some senses, I think that is playing out as it probably would have played out regardless of who was in office. I think on Iran, I think I haven't seen the intelligence, so it's hard for me to say. But I expect that, a Harris administration would have also been confronted at some point with that decision. Whether it was the point of so soon, I don't know. And I haven't seen the intelligence, so I don't know if something really did trigger the shift there. I tend to think that there was still room for diplomacy and getting to a similar, if not more enduring outcome. But, Bibi Netanyahu obviously saw an opportunity while Iran was on its back foot on the degradation of their proxies in the region to take action. And, I expect that he probably put that, decision in front of the president of the United States. And so, that could have happened under any administration. I think, my view is that the Iran challenge is one that has vexed many administrations. I worked actually on the Iran issue myself in the George W. Bush administration. I was the Iran director at the NSC under both George W. Bush and President Obama. So I myself have worked on that problem set for quite some time. And I think it's really challenging. And, every president, for as long as I can remember, has said that we cannot let Iran acquire a nuclear weapon. So can't predict whether Trump versus someone else would have made that decision. It's hard to know. But certainly, I think Trump himself is definitely not afraid of slaying sacred cows in foreign policy. I think he has no fidelity towards some of the norms, some of the sort of assumptions about the global war, the global trade dynamics. He doesn't have any fidelity to normal kind of procedures, and so I think it is different under Trump a little bit than it would be under a different.
Is that an asset for him? Like, does that open up doors and give him more opportunities, or is it a liability in terms of then maybe the unpredictability that comes with it, or a lack of trust because people are not, they don't have the same sense of surety about how you're going to act on something?
I think it's both, to be quite honest. I think he has figured out how to use uncertainty to his advantage. And I think people should probably study that many years from now, because it is interesting to watch how even in the context of Iran and that decision, his messaging was kind of all over the place in the public domain. And it did make it hard for people to really understand kind of where he was going to be and what was going to happen, whether that was by design, as his team is now saying, or whether that was just Trump actually being uncertain himself about what he was going to do. But he does tend to use that. You see it happening in trade negotiations. So he's kind of a master at that. And, it has yielded some results. But whether or not those results are enduring and stable over time is a real question. Whether allies, in particular, feel comfortable at the trust level that what the president says is actually going to happen or not happen. I think that is an open debate.
And I mean, I know that you wouldn't have seen the intelligence briefings on Iran, but do you get a sense, because we've heard these mixed messages on how productive or effective these strikes were, do you get a sense of the efficacy of these strikes on Iranian nuclear sites? Did they achieve the outcomes they were going for?
Yes. Whenever I talk about this issue, I always say that verification, because it is going to be important, because I think there is a public lack of clarity about kind of where we are. My sense, based on what I've seen in the public domain and what people are saying, communicating from key positions within the administration, and especially General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I do think that the action has set back the Iranian nuclear program pretty significantly. I mean, it went after key, there's sort of three core dimensions of the program, right? It's the people, it's the material, and it's the enrichment, right? And clearly they went after a lot of that. Now, whether or not they got all the stockpile, I don't know. I suspect they did not. But it's clear to me that they're at least several months delayed, if not a year or two or more, potentially in the ability to build a bomb. Now, whether that is going to be enduring is an open question on where they go now. So I think that the importance of diplomacy right now, mainly just to be able to get the inspectors back in and to be able to get a better sense of where things are, I think is going to be critical, because the Iranians, could potentially now drive their program further underground, and that does worry me. That now they're clearly incentivized to not declare everything and pursue covert enrichment. So whether or not they make a dash for the bomb, I don't know. The supreme leader, ironically, has been a brake on that decision. There are certainly elements of the Iranian system that would probably want to go for a bomb, specifically the IRGC. So whether or not the supreme leader shifts on that post-strike, I think, is an interesting question.
Yeah, very interesting. Another, kind of defense policy idea that's been put forth in this Trump administration is the Golden Dome, which is kind of modeled after Israel's Iron Dome. So what can you tell us about this Golden Dome, and how effective do you think it would be in terms of increasing U.S. security?
Yes, I think, on Golden Dome, I think it's going to be very important for the administration to get more specific about what it is and what it isn't. Because right now, it's not clear entirely what it is and what it all encompasses. And, it's almost like a blind man's petting zoo. If you put your hand, one person puts their hand in and they feel a trunk, another person puts their hand in and they feel a tail. I think we got to have clarity around that. The reason I say that is because in order for such a significant initiative to be successful, you have to have a sense of A, what you're trying to build towards, B, alignment of the system and the resources towards it. I mean, we just got $25 billion in the recent budget bill that just passed through Congress for Golden Dome. Who's in control of it? What's the command and control structure? Who's the lead service on this? So a lot of those questions, I think, are still pending out there. What is interesting to me, though, is that I think it's an opportunity, because U.S. Homeland Defense has gotten significantly more challenging in the last, even like the last 5 to 10 years. And so I do think there's a need for something like this. We need more domain awareness. We need better sensors. We need better space-based systems. We need more missile defense and counter UAS. So, you sort of watched what happened in Russia with the Ukrainian drone attack on their bomber fleet. Maybe that could happen in the United States someday. So I think that the impulse and the impetus behind Golden Dome is correct, and I think it's just important now for the administration to really lay out kind of where it wants to take it. It will take time and it'll take a lot of money, most likely, but it is, I think, overall a good thing to try to address the Homeland Defense challenges that face the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it's innovative thinking and looking at kind of, what can be and what can be achieved. One of the big things that's making a lot of headlines in Australia, similar to something you've touched on already in terms of what the Trump administration has done with NATO, and that you say, the Biden administration would have wanted to focus on that increase in defense spending as well. And, Secretary Hegseth has talked a fair bit about Australia's need to increase their defense spending. I mean, that's been a talking point he's having with a lot of U.S. allies and partners. So, what do you think is driving this intense focus on U.S. allies increasing their, defense spending to 3.5% or 5% of GDP? What's behind that? And is that something that we would have seen as a target under the Biden administration as well?
Yeah. Again, I think this is, the U.S. asking allies to spend more on national defense is not a new concept. It's been a goal of many administrations. I think what's behind it is in part President Trump's view that allies generally kind of need to be doing more and that we do too much. I think he just fundamentally believes that that's the case and that we're kind of, being like chumps, I guess. I think it's, it's a very simplified view of allies. I mean, I think the good news is that all of our allies, many of them are extremely capable. I would put Australia at the top of the list, frankly, in terms of its capabilities, in terms of being a capable partner. I think that regardless of whether the Trump administration is making this an issue and sort of it's become very political, I think regardless, the countries in the region, and the Indo-Pacific region in particular, need to be spending more on national defense, given the security environment. I mean, Australia it had its own strategic review, defense strategic review, which made this recommendation for increased spending. So I think it's in Australia's interest to do so. Now, Australia obviously is a sovereign nation and is going to make its own decisions about how it spends its money. But I would think that given the context of what we're all facing in terms of, rising China, but also the collaboration between China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, that should be alarming to any democracies around the world that are dealing with security issues. So I tend to be more of a booster of defense spending, given my career, and I certainly understand the trade-offs that a country like Australia would face. But I think that the administration is going to look to Australia to do more. That is obvious. That is clearly at the top of their priority list. And I think it's now up to Australia to think about what's in its interests. And I think the security environment is alarming enough that I think Australia should take a very close look at that.
And I think one of the most significant or most talked about areas for defense spending in Australia would be the AUKUS agreement, which was, an agreement that happened under the Biden administration. And it looks at, a massive injection of funds both into Australia's own defense capability, but also into the U.S. defense industrial base as part of this agreement. But now the U.S. Undersecretary for Defense Policy, Elbridge Colby, has initiated this AUKUS review, which I think will be landing soon.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, I know. But at the time of this recording, it's not yet been landed. And he's made a lot of prior remarks with flagging concerns about AUKUS. Not that he's saying that it has bad objectives, but that he's concerned that it will U.S. doesn't have enough of the nuclear-powered submarines for itself. It's behind on its production capability. And so how can you be giving away submarines to other countries? Well, not giving away, but how can you be releasing and selling these submarines to other countries when the U.S. is falling short of its own goals? So now he's driving this review. Can you talk us through what really is behind this review, what you think they'll be getting out of it, and what should we be watching for as we hear what comes out as a result of this review?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that it's not abnormal for a new administration to look at major policy initiatives of a prior administration and to decide where they fit, right? Whether they want to keep them going or whether they want to add more resources or shift resources. So that part in and of itself is not concerning. I would say Bridge Colby, Secretary Colby, he obviously publicly expressed his own personal skepticism about the agreement well before he took this position within the department. I think I'm optimistic that the review will essentially discover what we discovered when we put together the AUKUS agreement during the Biden administration, which is this is an important generational investment in collective deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, and that despite it being challenging for all parties involved, that it was extremely worth it and also, frankly, required. So I think at the strategic level, I don't expect that the review is going to come out and say we don't want to do AUKUS anymore. Like I don't think that that's going to be the case. I would be shocked.
Yeah.
Mainly because I think there is a consensus within the administration that deterring the Chinese is top priority. So I think ripping up AUKUS would just serve no purpose. I do think that there's a couple of sort of pathways here that could happen on the review. I do think that the administration may try to seek more Australian investment in the submarine industrial base. And it could get kind of wrapped up in the broader conversation about Australian defense spending. So maybe that gets kind of tied into those negotiations. That's one piece. And then so for Canberra, I think the question is, if that is the case, what does Canberra do, and can they navigate through that to preserve what's obviously an important initiative? Another option I think that could come out of the review is that they just find a way to quote unquote Trumpify it.
Yeah.
And I think that there's, in my view, there's opportunity, especially in Pillar 2, which is the pillar that is less discussed in public. Everyone focuses on the submarines, but the opportunities in Pillar 2 are quite significant. And frankly, they align with a lot of the priorities of the Trump administration, especially on defense technology and disruptive, sort of emerging technologies. So I think that there is a place where they could potentially expand Pillar 2 or, make it more focused or driven around specific issues. Maybe they look at another pillar, they add a pillar. Maybe they lean into space. Or Golden Dome, maybe there's some dimension of that between the United States, Australia, and the UK. So I'm hopeful that, the fundamentals are strong enough that the Trump Pentagon will come out in the right place. Certainly, I think there's broad support in other parts of the administration. Secretary Rubio, in particular, is supportive. There's significant bipartisan consensus on this on the Hill. So I think that the environment for the decision is probably a strong one. But I don't know. Yeah. Obvious, we'll find out. But I suspect it'll either be, some sort of conversation about further Australian investment, plus maybe some Trumpifying of the agreement to make it more of his kind of initiative.
Yeah, and USSC experts have published a fair bit recently, especially on Pillar 2, and maybe how it's lost its way a little bit, or it's very nebulous and expansive, but it doesn't have that sense of really what is the purpose and the focus, like you mentioned. So there's a lot of opportunity there because I think things kind of been cobbled together and added to it. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, but without a clear sense of where is it going, what is it achieving. So there would be a lot that could be done on that.
Yeah, and actually, quite honestly, when even in the Biden administration, we were frustrated with Pillar 2 and sort of why can't we get something going here that's more concrete? And I think I do think it needs to be more focused. I think it needs to deliver just one or two, technological solutions for an operational problem that exists for the alliances. And it's simple as that. And it became a little bit of a Christmas tree because everybody wanted a piece of AUKUS because it was the big thing. And so I do think it requires a lot more focus. I think the Trump administration would do right by doing that.
Yeah. And it is something because there's, these multifaceted negotiations going on between Australia and the United States right now, around the trade and tariffs piece and around defense spending and around AUKUS and a lot of things. So where these things start to kind of intersect, that can be part of this broader discussion that's being had. I guess my last question before I get your by the numbers stat would be, where do you think that Indo-Pacific allies and partners can find the most common ground on defense policy with the Trump administration? And how would you recommend they kind of approach their discussions and their approach with the Trump administration at this time?
I think there's a lot of opportunity to align Australian interests with where the Trump administration wants to focus its priorities. I would list a couple of things. One is defense technology and innovation. There, I think there's huge potential for the alliance to do more in that regard together, whether it's part of AUKUS Pillar 2 or just more broadly. So I think that's sort of one area I would lean into. Second is secure supply chains. I do think that there's commonality of view around secure supply chains. And so I think having that conversation, maybe, pulling that into an AUKUS conversation or into a broader bilateral conversation, I think will be important. Golden Dome. Where does Australia fit in Golden Dome? Especially given the capabilities at Pine Gap, I think there's an interesting potential alignment there that could be pursued. On the sort of regional policy side, I think leaning into the sort of multilaterals, the sort of trilaterals and the Quad, I think is a good way to demonstrate both Australian leadership, which it should be doing in the context of the region, but also building that sort of latticed, alliance network, and sort of, basically being the ballast or the leader. It's an opportunity for Australia to lead, I think, in some of those conversations. So whether it's the Squad or Quad or the Japan, what do they call it? Australia, Japan, US. So I think doing a lot more kind of at the regional level. I think Australia leading in that, I think, is a good thing. And I think there's common views of where the US would be on some of those issues. So I think those are the main ones. I think demonstrating that the alliance is kind of, modular and can do many things for the United States, but also for Australia's interests. So,
all right. Well, it's really interesting. And I have to say, pointing to these areas of continuity between the administrations and really the opportunities that there are for allies and partners, I find quite encouraging and something helpful to focus on. I would love to get your by the numbers stat. What do you have for us?
Okay, this one stressed me out quite a bit.
Okay.
This task stressed me out because I was like, which angle do I come from? But I'm going to pick with something that is pretty close to my heart because having worked on AUKUS and worked on industrial base issues a lot in the United States in my time in government, it's very stark. I think we all are collectively learning that our industrial bases are, let's just say, sclerotic, and not where they need to be. I think everyone knows that now. But here's my statistic. Okay, so China produced 170 ships the last decade. That's more than the United States, Australia, Japan, and the UK combined. And I say that not because I think China is 10 feet tall, because there's obviously qualitative differences between some of American ships versus Chinese ships. And they're certainly less battle tested than we are. But it does point to a capacity problem that we have. And at some point, mass does matter. And I think, solving our industrial base constraints, whether it's the maritime industrial base or just more broadly the industrial base, is going to be like should be the number one priority of alliances for like the next, decade. Because it's clear we're not where we need to be. And Ukraine was really instructive for me on that front, just sort of watching how hard it was, across 50 nations just to cobble together enough munitions for the Ukrainians, to sort of manage the Russians. Imagine a world in which we're confronting not just a Russia, but a China and a Russia in conflict as allies. We've got to giddy up.
Yep. Well, that is a sobering statistic, but thank you so much for sharing that as well as your other insights. And just as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that might be of interest to our listeners. There's the Asia Chessboard podcast, where our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is the host. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series, which runs recording from our major live events. Kelly herself will be doing a public event with us, and so the recording from that will be available on the USSC Live podcast series. You can find that on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.